Well, on to another group of new voters. Young people. A campaign's being launched this week to persuade more of them to register to vote, and it comes after figures reveal that only a quarter of them plan to go to the polling booths in the next general election. It's all a far cry from the early days of the fight for democracy, when the East Midlands played a leading role and thousands of young people fought and sometimes lost their lives for the right to vote. Here's our political editor, John Hess.
On the march to Nottingham Castle for the right to vote. It's 1831 and there's fury. The landed aristocracy had blocked the right to vote. In retaliation, Nottingham Castle was torched.
Well, this is where we think the rioters actually broke in.
Ted Cantle knows all about voting. He used to run the election counts in Nottingham. Now he wants to sit his historic role in the march to secure the right to vote to be celebrated.
I think it's really crucial that people understand just how hard fought the campaign was to win the vote, and the 1831 riots, which we're featuring here in this exhibition, will explain some of that.
It'll give us the history, but can it explain why so many young people these days aren't using their vote? At the last general election, only a quarter, 25% of young people between the ages of 18 and 24 actually voted. By the time of the next election, 4 million young people will be eligible to vote. Yet a recent survey by Hansard indicated that out of that group, only 12% were likely to use that vote.
It's not that I'm not voting out of apathy. I'm not voting out of absolute indifference and weariness and exhaustion from the lies, treachery, deceit of the political class that has been going on for generations now.
Did actor and author Russell Brand strike a chord? And does he speak for many of his generation?
I'm not really interested in politics and stuff.
I firmly believe in the fact that if you don't vote, then you don't actually get to have a say.
Here in the school classroom, there are 48 questions that go to the heart of the current political and economic debate. But if our politicians struggle with these questions, well, there are some future voters here who might be able to come up with some answers.
Why is it important to vote?
Well, every single person, their vote is equal.
If we didn't vote, it wouldn't be a democracy anymore, it'd be more like a dictatorship.
A session of the school council at the National Academy in the Nottinghamshire town of Hacknell, and there's a key vote.
So all of those who are in favour of votes at 16, raise your hand. Those against?
Beth Garwood is eligible to vote already.
I was 18 on the 18th of January, but I'm not sure about registering to vote because it's all a complicated process now.
That's why next week a national campaign called Bite the Ballot will attempt to persuade Beth and many other young people to get on the register so they don't lose that right to vote. Historically, this is a pretty grisly place to be because on this spot in 1832 the gallows were built and 3 men were hanged, George Hearson, George Beck and John Armstrong, for their part in the Nottingham riots and their campaign to extend the right to vote.
Democracy was very hard fought and people suffered a great deal to get the vote.
Out of the embers of Nottingham Castle, the spark of universal suffrage. A new generation is now being urged not to take that right for granted.
Well, Dom Anderson from Derby is the Vice Chairman of the National Union of Students and joins us in the studio. Dom, the people we saw and heard from there in John's report were all keen to vote, but how common is that?
Well, we've done research that suggests that the vast proportion of students at least want to register to vote. But I think that, they're actually voting, that's for parties themselves to really give students a passion and really make students want to get out and want to vote for them.
Why aren't so many young people interested in politics? What's switching them off?
Well, I think that they feel like they've been lied to in the past. Students were told that if they voted a certain way, they'd receive a certain, tuition fees being removed, but actually that never happened. And a lot of students did turn out in record numbers in 2010 and found that they just weren't getting what they'd voted for.
Well, John, you're a supporter of lowering the voting age to 16. Would that help?
I hope it would help. I mean, I don't think it's a silver bullet, or I don't think a load of 16-year-olds are suddenly going to start voting. But I think if you give 16-year-olds the vote, because there's lots of other things they can do in life at 16, I hope they will get more engaged in the process. But I also think that...
Catch them early.
Well, catch them early, but I also think governments of all parties, I'm not making a party sample, of all parties, tend to cut back on things like EMAs or the tuition fees and tend to introduce policies that perhaps favour other sections of society. I suspect if they thought a load of 16-year-olds were going to come out and vote, they'd be less cavalier about making those types of policy decisions.
Andrew, would you lower it?
I wouldn't. Only about 20% of the population think it's a good idea, and even a majority of 16 to 18-year-olds don't think it's a good idea. I've done straw polls in my senior schools with 16 to 18-year-olds, and it's always been 66% of those people have said that they shouldn't have the vote till they're 18. So I think it's pretty much overwhelming.
Dom, is it the case that young people feel that they don't have to get so engaged in politics so they can become politically active in other ways? They can campaign on Twitter and Facebook and they don't have to wait for a change in government for things to change?
Well, I think that, you know, it's a bit of a two-way street. Students do like being activists and young people do like to get involved in campaigns that are important to them. But, you know, if you ask young people from certain areas whether they feel that there's a point in them voting, if no politician has ever said anything that was interesting to them, why would they bother? You know, I think that if you put the politics channel on, you'll see things that are just aimed at a certain generation and people who would traditionally go out and vote.
You're on this programme.
Yeah.
And we're very glad you are, by the way.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So is it really going to make a difference if young people don't vote then?
Young people, well, I mean, we'll just have the same of what we've always had, really. I think that if politicians are more accountable to young people, then, you know, this is through citizenship education as well. Because I often hear it said that young people wouldn't understand.
So they're looking for you to say something interesting, Andrew Bridgen.
Absolutely. Well,
say something interesting for young people.
I joined the Conservatives when I was at Nottingham University a long time ago in 1983. Only 6 weeks ago, I took part in a debate at Nottingham Trent University.
Yeah, I mean, we're not saying that they're not interested.
I attend lots of
school
visits and try and engage with the children.
They're very interested in the issues, of course they are, because you know they're affected by them.
And I think a lot of young people get involved in single issue politics now.
But I disagree. I think if you think about young people, like they will be more engaged if they are given more of a platform. So a lot of the time you see tokenistic efforts of politicians going into schools and wheeling out whatever new policy they have, and that isn't actually making them want to feel that they're buying it.
I can assure you, school children ask the most difficult questions you'll ever get asked as a politician. You don't even see where they're coming from.
Yeah, but for that reason, they should be involved in the policy making
John will know that we're having more and more school visits and young people coming to visit the Houses of Parliament every year, and the Speaker's encouraging that.
Is that right, John?
I actually think this Speaker, who was actually, John Burko was in Leicester last week doing a big event with students, and the students actually loved him because he's a class act, really. I mean, he was very good at, he chaired a debate as if it was the House of Commons, and he went down a storm. But
with all the shouting?
With all the shouting. But I think you made a really good point, you know. I think you were talking about the Parliament channel when it seems really boring, and sometimes the debates we have...
They're not going to like that,
sometimes
guys.
the debates we have...
I hope you weren't speaking.
I think it was your speech. What we do is, we sometimes have these... this is a serious point. We disagree for the sake of disagreeing sometimes, and yet we go off into the tea room afterwards,
really?
and we're like, we have a cup of tea with each other. It's like Hulk Hogan and WWF wrestling. It's a nonsense sometimes. Politicians should, if they agree with each other, they should work together on issues.
Briefly and finally, are you reassured by anything you hear?
I mean, not particularly. I think if you look at politics altogether and look at this programme here, you know, you've seen from 4 men. And there's lots of young women who are probably watching this programme thinking, politics will never be for me.
Oh,
and, you know,
Don, we'll have to leave it there, sadly.